Hello everyone, it's me Michael, and this is Bore Me to Sleep, the series dedicated to helping people sleep. More specifically, this video will lull you to sleep by boring you with unintelligible nonsense. For this episode, I'll be using vocabulary and sentence structure that vaguely emulates a reading on the Count of Monte Cristo. I've used machine learning to generate a monologue that doesn't make much sense in order to provide you the same comfort as falling asleep in a lecture. Please don't try to understand the script. Many people enjoy falling asleep to videos like this, but some can't as the material is too interesting. The words I say will vaguely pertain to the subject, but will be fragmented enough where a meaning can't be found. The effect created is a boring lecture where you can't understand or pay attention even if you wanted to. Therefore, I suggest you get comfortable and try to sleep. Let the words wash over you and let your mind drift. If this video helps you do that, please consider supporting. Liking, sharing, and subscribing help these episodes reach other people that need them. By the way, Bore Me to Sleep is ever evolving, and I'm continuing to dial in my delivery, cadence, and overall sound. I try to make myself sound boring in these episodes, so let me know what you think. Ultimately, this project is for you, so your feedback is hugely appreciated and will be used for continuous improvement. For those who feel background music is a little too distracting, I invite you to listen to the standard version. It features my voice without any additions. I'll now begin the lecture, so please enjoy and sleep well. To her history I do not say on the contrary to time. You look at the object of being death after the death of Madame de Morcerf, who appears to me the truth of one of the crew of Marseille, who is connected to his benefactor. And as Morcerf has thus of money in the world, of the last few years the crime I was unable to see here pass away. And then I saw in the middle of one of the stairs someone were gradually on top of the circle and followed into the house of the dungeon. To the man who sold the prisoner that was to be held, it called to be a noble Catalan, one and a beautiful girl of Marseille, the daughter who was ruined of Marseille, to at least be a priest of a man of a father, and offered his name Andrea to Madame Danglars. Into particulars of the recital of my life have you made you angry and most other young. You have in my own life, and you will have them make my carriage, and you will take me to the box of money with Eugenie pronounced these words so much pale. As beautiful Providence went on to her chair, at this moment she appeared as rapid as usual. Tears out of her own part, with a long degree of interest in this house, had no doubt to be his companion, no one of them but now. What a tomb of that fortune is for the first time to dispose of my double birth. The proof of our interest has happened to your house, should you know. By the greatest extent you are so interested as a year you are alone. So a more certain matter than myself, for you who will pursue to become a poor girl, who lives in you the last 4 years. He had entered first, found a person at the house at Rome, France. We have an old brother in my service. You must be of my old master and my son-in-law for Mercedes. In the last hour you must have to accomplish what I was going to the theater to the poor prisoner who had heard consciousness of this feature. They received no promise of watching him for the purpose of returning to this 100th month, before the third time was generally buried. His costume from the other side of the wall flew back, and the door closed on the road which led to the garden belonged to the governor of San. From the day on the Count of Monte Cristo, and Albert with a degree of affection, for it was only one of the two Madame Danglars. By her de Villefort, and then as she looked at her with a glance of love, as it had witnessed he felt a strange prison, and each other at times, at moments, he had placed himself with his arms and went forth to the same kind of night. Then I felt myself as my departure, as your companion. It is as she asks. Do you be alarmed at this moment with her confidence and violence? He gave them to her belief that he loved for his grief during the whole days of his own life. Of the two who had the people, the emperor of the country officer who is his carriage, to a bearer of bell, 2 doors saying to a ball drawing room. A small line to the salon was up to the point of a second, which was opened, and a young girl of 25, or his who had a year since. I have finished the guilty person. He will have in his purse with his feelings, I know, still wants to mention your name at least 4 or 10 years I was a man, who had to put the daughter in a somewhere about him to the door, and placing in his carriage merely a cell in 5 written. In some arbor they were built in the dark master, and the south entered at the post hand of the Danglars. They did not pay his son in his duties, and not as his misery at a moment of a sort of kind. which he might be popular than the Lampworth in the middle of the Colosseum, in which he had been accustomed to have its enthusiastic and then with the same coolness and assassination. He had left the house of Monte Cristo found himself by himself to be carried with it. The young man who had brought us into the world had strength to take its beautiful countess to the mysterious chair. This gentleman is informed by the body of love of ill feeling, of changing conversation or death to all the fine things with my plans. There with the other motive of life, and the poor child was so long time to guess. He could not be disturbed by the servant if it was not a million spread in the hand of the three young men. Returned from the adjoining room in a voice, but there was none of any account, the 100 of the papers, and the usurper is that man of French, yet cannot at any least hotel for the Count of Sand situated. At the name of Vampa, when the Count entered the hotel and gave to the next, he had only saw him in any dreadful tone, and Peppino was a new man. A rapid blow of the Legion of Honor, and which insisted of having heard in the chateau a sort of sea that he was on the point of sending him to be silent. This was at this time to be the place of the last drop of color. He had passed by the Count, and my magnificence his look is directed to the effect of the moment her husband with his complexion and eyes. When he saw her gesture at his face, with a sad smile, his face was one of the more acute and would have felt inclined for a moment to leave him or a piece of a full night. The risk of terror to be proud, the audience had occupied with the music of the house of the Abbé Busoni, which you will not see that there is a telegraph I wish to enter it as 5 or 2 beings. He is to be very old, I called. And have you will venture to the title himself, of here you may find that once upon yesterday to me as soon as possible, on the same account with us than those of your best men who are those beautiful enough to keep your post, and therefore sufficiently life to the life of the heart was a scene of terror. As he had heard the degree of the notary and this master were at the foot of a tree being killed, and the governor of the Palais, and so ready the innkeeper whose apartment will be again by Nortier, and Danglars was compelled to be a statue of the Catalan village of Debray, who had no reason of any longer in any papers, who gave it the same sign with her own decor. The most proofs that were just of thinking, such a time pistol servant who had them was not heard. The shadow of the garden that you came in a few minutes ago. It has been 4 days connected with him, which have been taken to the garden of the second 5 minutes in the second act, of which he had been approaching the Count on the first evening before that, which he had seen in the darkness the Count went to see the Count drawing around, and had bestowed upon the south of the vessel with paid to the Parisian, by a real marriage and the subject of the love. The messenger should be quite at the master, he has none for the love of God, and I now can be alone in pity on all my misfortunes. I have taken myself to you, my happy friend, my mother who has been overcome. By all these last, come to live with their reason at your hands, they were once at the salon they entered with their feet, and the breath for a visit of the costume. He did not have been less overwhelmed, and was so kept by a course that the previous night had been behind a means of the event, which he had already made him for a feeling of her, and he would be convinced of the person to be there in the south. You have lost this year or ere long. I had longed and thought of it could. You have been late here for the year during my absence from the past. Now I will call you make my own. Counsel to you in my house to receive any note with me short of sighs, as I am really proud of my skill, and am at once of your first attack try to obtain my aid or devotion in he. Are you to know would this Count speak now, in order to know that any vessel has been seen before Andrea, was now in the sight and turned to him as he looked at both sides, from the rest of himself, or retire. The most important, which had not been long, the difficult of Paris and the Count of Monte Cristo was a most singular history, as this Fernand. The following latter was delirious of age in the fine night of this terrible affair. The imagination of Prince Vampa, who was sent by the Emperor of his friends in Monte Cristo, assumed the name of a friend, a victory, a man was great merit, up to the belief that the most conversation had never been truly taken into account. I need not to return to the Catalan's dinner. I draw so distance in a small of beings under the hout of a course. The 2 young men who had been his only protector to sustain the better which had once, in a single respect for his strength, the day had continued to take any means. At the end of his teeth, the Count had only disappeared in his illness, and Madame Danglars returned to his own house, that he remained for his grand of his place. On the left of the quay to go to the Count of Monte Cristo he knew. He was wrong to captify. Then he wanted to go to be very important. He should be so good as a young man as one did ever so few. Him minutes past Lucian so remained of the Alexander King, which was written to the crowd in the hole that were the night sleep about 40,000 most favorable change. In the affair at the port of your visit, the 5th of the next day for so many years of the city, in the world without speaking to me it made me a year they had no more. The left day, and we were just seen in the court of a queen, at the bottom of a hand of wine, and the jailer fell full of cold. The noise on the deck called Faria. But of the first time he had held the key of his coachman, when a hand of the General Despair and Lord Wilmore in a garden. And every time at the chamber the Count was coming towards the door of the house, and Thomas and French officer with the latter himself loved, and he was more Edmund than his two friends, and set to depart himself was announced that he was well informed. Him when the 3 windows will have sufficiently wide open, and the Piazza del Popolo presented with one another, in the fact that had been so much over the most unexpected manner myself. The person from whom they were addressed to the diamond he was mistaken. There in 14 years of the whole affair I am here in Paris, to be tomorrow for 2 weeks is a vessel of great one. Of France and men with the ladies naturally calm, and spread upon itself the 2 young men of Monte Cristo, the governor of the yacht was a man who no doubt had knowing the honor of not being Mademoiselle de Villefort in her house, and your father, I would seem to help his foot, and he will be sure that he may get rid of his fate at his death, when he heard him in an open, but would rather have supposed, to meet Morel, to be here that he took the pistols, but the money he entered with his house. And he turned to the Count, to the person who Count himself, on the subject. When he had led him, no doubt it was a mirror of error in his hand, he uttered in hand of the young man, and without making any feeling of look in him. The condition of uttering this diamond of water, and evidently accustomed to make his senses to moist and calm, the expression more plainly that Valentine had felt the nervous heart of a man sitting down. A glass of biscuit was offered to him to an introduction of the Count of Monte Cristo, and came to him with the facility and moved in a word followed by the second invitation he had turned away. Then he thought full of this meaning and caused to escape him into the moment. The grating of the curtain felt like the corpse of spectators, the eyes of the corpse, which livid the required his knife. Embarrassed how he could not be angry with this courage, which was not a grandfather on board given the hopes of the previous finding. The intended Countess of the Countess of Sofrans remained in the same drawing room. The Count returned to the gate of the vessel Monte Cristo, appeared to see the valet de chambre, who told him all his mind was in these terrible, because there could not only see what the rays of the young girl opened her eyes with, on the box by the Count of Sand get out of the island of Elba, on which in heart the branches of some secret and poor old man who had always loved you, a short-lived acquainted with the blow of the servant, had long entered Mademoiselle de Morcerf, which had left him in Madame de Villefort, her room. The house of this event for Louis, or young companion in the tomb of the notary towards whom the Count was informed. The doctor who had left him in the same time, and he was just at an early age, story during the Count, which had just lowered himself for the beginning of the fortune, and that of Morcerf should have brought the name of the bad physician on this account for a moment of 14 months in his gratitude. He was young Captain Dantès, and he could not cease to love her with all weight of affection. His son from Madame Danglars ran as she went away with the gate sealed in her eyes. In my mother and one raised her eyes with each other grief, which had been touched, and it was so paper to excite suspicion, and which the dew, still so favorable to listen to me as it is possible, and adding a pair of horses worth such horses whose course are called to be the most upright. By this time we had been given to the Count of Eugenie. I have taken to my conscience, will you sign me again to make a confession of your advice for my son, but you'll bury my grief again, coming out of my arms to be ready in the year, and now I will have to draw myself in some city, even in his manner, since the confidential sailor of the house was arranged. In his way, he was coming to the drawing room in the inside of my card, where he heard guests that Albert had saved one of them from the 2 days past here in Paris, who every day to remain at Marseille for a fortnight, not like a notary, and the daughter of the box which Ali had just now made. His place for in the house of Ali, and in the few minutes they had fancied the jug which had been directed in the former suspicion. whom the Count of Monte Cristo had called his, and to Madame Eugenie. With an immense mother, and noticed the Count all agitated, he had only been his courage to receive his daughter to be silent and smiled in his house. As he felt his joy and a stone towards the house of his mother, she was still insensible that with her ideas, this was made up for her, and that not would have been very fancy. I think magnificent misfortunes when the Count was mad, and so bad, a young sailor acquaintance, with a blow in the man of a corpse. The Count of Monte Cristo asked the person with an agent, and announced for the singular chance which was succeeded in the world of her misfortunes, which she had been named and her father was not over 121, of those curiously useful with persons who are carrying out the Danglars, and that of his devotion he was not speaking to the blow of the man who was yet proud of her friend, and very much of our country, as you will see, has been master to defend yourself, and at your arrival with me you have nothing to find at your house. With your friend mine I was going to live as I now. I have no reason to lose you, my father has been able to show. Last night I felt so much, but as many as my heart is to believe, another high of the bandits. Once more than ever to have been able to content myself, and that what he had done for a serious purpose is you, beautifully young, who had killed such a skillful father. I sought for it with a doctor to the Count of Monte Cristo, and Albert it was the Marquis to take Albert less strong. He would be so welcome of 5 years connected to the young girl who was taken to visit his prayers, to which he saw, but they not had been the same time in the room at the sight of Vampa, which meant to by Baron, by an enemy and the man with his new acquaintance to the Count of Monte Cristo, or of the Count of Morcerf for the Vicomte Albert de Morcerf, which came from him, but before he was still acquainted with the King Procureur, who employed himself in the same manner as Love, and the old gentleman, with the wife of Mercedes, by whom all wishes for his fortune depended on my honor to be Signor Vampa, that I must be arms to the King Attorney, at the house, and sent the letter to Madame Danglars twice, as all it had been so long the beautiful furniture of the corridor and the young man had ever felt. To all the old, and returned to her home, she noticed Valentine in a gloomy silence, and that she could not appear to his hand as if it had been out, but in the dim of the light. The Count had him left, and the Danglars followed him with the woman living accustomed to him. The young girl uttered a cry, and fainted in the last 2 words, to which she was deceived, and entered the name of a voice, and was the same expression that she fancied, and she could not bear her breath. She went to her usual early, and had only feeling of her husband, who, although her grandfather may diminish my family service, at your service you will see that some other life, or that I possess so overcome. I have seen a couple of the captains of a father according to his duty, he only related, but his mind was in the unwilling. To find it was only a servant who could conduct him when he paid for his food in a corner. The letter read in the air of Alexander that he was seated in a cloak at the door which had broken off of the table, and which the whole face of the old man we shall see to have him led into the garden where we now have. To find time with everybody else, and how many years well known in prison. He is well known to be in a week. I have in my house and with our property in vain, and in another, they have very clear towards the ancient house. In order to find one with the supper of the Frenchman, we were all the answer of the governor. The Baroness was one of the oldest. The wall and the Countess had forgotten to give the means of its communication thus. The vessel was prepared and black in the air, and the patron of the stairs of the ladder. The position of my father and Albert with one hand in a chair at the top of the stairs. In a month of the Duke to see your house in a study, when the paragraph is set and happy, they wish to suppose that they have been 100 paces for the same night, which had begun it, and therefore went to the window of the young man, in which Faria, that were a man of Vampa. Should you know a good deed, at no time, said the Major with a terror, and stay here to take the time of these young captains. We will sell it to the house and date to go to work with the same obscurity. The jeweler opened his head and ordered his attention to receive him to share. The supper with him so much terror that he was on the verge of earth, and then the sailors had taken their limbs and their notes, which had now occupied themselves, the Count of whom were addressed to the Countess, which had returned to Monte Cristo her eyes on the picture. To the same story which had been so long made, the throne of the requisite information had given to everyone made to weep. From the cemetery, and of my word to have you expect, someone who now took his study to me in the Marquis of my captivity. My duty was given to the law, that you had long gained the banks of this time. For half an hour to her son, who was also left by the month 6, or 6I, which had been intended to be spoken of. It was the child who forced from the struggle the shade, while the mother began open at the second time and took away. You paid me some day of my sister, and that she was always wanted some other done, of my own poor son. And the whole most of the cruel world always was the chest of the house, who would be one of the most ancient families of his heart to the throne. On the day of the king he was the personage, with a real name of the Viscount. We know that it was the second time with the charmed, with which you have made it so full of heavy that I was overcome with struggle, and ask him, had he said with his ear to the simple equation with the letter of a man, like rather with a France, or a woman of our daughter whose father was never lived in your house, in Paris, and 7, or leave me in Paris for the horses of my story. A few words in the closet of the street, pacing like a small case of the salon, which would have even from the late reverie would have been in a singular merit for the messenger, which had been so much of this unexpected, and her duty was gone as to him. The share of the meeting then ran Danglars for the Count, and horses in the ruin of the Colosseum, which my grandfather would be saved. At a father he is saved, and a father of the father is never known to make him from the engagement, in which we were arrested on the road, to the leading of the house to the left, without the house to the hour of a prisoner assembled. It was sitting at the table by one side of the desk, entered with his hand over the moment of a messenger. The fair face was still on a bright opposite wave of the bright wall, and the whole of the opera box was in perfect costume in particular night. There could see the pale and instinctive stiffened body, the other in a full saw of the deepest silence. No one could have been over his body in the month. With his friend, and awaited, the Danglars all event had caused my guest in the world, and the sudden 3 in cry were headed back to the board. But it's Dante's wish. The Count had made him his enough to see if that made any interest in the world, at the last time of time and the fresh friends, which returned to himself with all speed at a long pace. He had not used as a part of the famous room, in the room he had just placed. On the roof of the table he discovered that it was not good fortune which in case of the god, it would be even introduced by such a stock like an excuse, and faithful and good, and it is lived in his firm and master. Which fell it to say against his emotion, I shall always be in the party of knowing the Greek girl. If you ever ask me to reproach with your excellency, I have only been 2 years to my absence from my father of 500 years. He is anxious to see you alive, mad when he has been so rooted, and to have the tongue which he displayed this morning, the first time to reply he left the cell, and had only shown the stranger to see with more violent violence, than which was heard, and the returned to the tartan happy. With the love of simple family in whom I just spoke, the feeling of drawing room in a corner of the wall, where there was any bandit for a young man of whom I was so doing. Since we must continue, I have not even the effect of time you have set unconsciously in the heart of her husband, and I feel I have exhausted every idea of money in need of Mademoiselle Valentine de Villefort. I have never seen my little value on her head, and presenting myself to be the most suitable apartment in the Parisienne. I yesterday asked my son to offer her you meaning, and think you what it is to share in any mysterious language he does not ask, or of what it is I want to believe between the day and the morning of a single night. No more and no one could be so bad that ever to his money in any case, to his prayers he said to go out with the house of Thompson and French in the country of Rome, which is here 10 years, and with every Russian a cabriolet was redoubled. At the garden when Vampa was obliged to enter, but besides, the Count read the following letter, and he was writing. After going on the road to the mother of the law and advancing towards Paris without the moment, if any other, and had become his hold, the one of the meeting of his banker, as well as they were first to be 12. The members of the court, then the coachman to the Hôtel de la Chaussée, the Albert had no one of safety then at home. The guests had proposed to seek the summons of old Morel, had kept up his treasure of the sort of horses arrived. He assembled to France that the magistrate would then make Madame France. Still, he had escaped the last 10 notes in his hand, with the air and read the hand so that he was right. It was in the full of his way that the love of him were all continual, and so skilful, well to realize 6 days. I believe in the house of an old man, whom he was pleased to take an instant against his servant, and he had heard the door of no farther hotel. But at the top of the staircase, and then the apparent effect affected her mind, to be formed of any other as he passed through the three corners. The house, without the same single knowledge that had failed for it to escape, no doubt was impossible to take. The desired opening and water in his left, the porter looked at the Count of Monte Cristo, and gathered on your cloak. At the banker's door of my carriage and house I will say to pass over the city, and the religious cried the bride of his arrival. At least 10 months since the top of the Rome left alone for the angle, the second society of his own life, and its presence even before he had been soon too useful. The summit of the steps he heard the small hands of Louis, to its cell where he bowed on the second day he had left him. And the secret to go into his drawing room where he knows only how much ever, and to be out of his cause of the departure only to see his own of the foundation, a living body of the most probably known of the guilt, and the questions as a man could be more single hope, than to his eyes, and assured him of his guests, and in the midst of the night in which the conservation was very effectively clear, and fresh appearance of the sort of men with their alarm in Naples, from his life, all the 7 of your majesty had 500,000 francs to me, which I was at my life an hour, like that which I suffered to make out of the malady, as you have this terrible secret. My father took all home the sum of horses, to the carnival at Paris so long. As for this man to my sister in the house of French officer of his father, the priest at this hour of the Count of Monte Cristo, a very day after this first visit was the advantage that a garden has given them no one these men, which may have seen you to know that it was a gentleman who killed him under his own step. He asked when she heard a voice. The Count had taken possession of his house, and to the banker who had returned to Spain, and flight of the banker, who had followed him in the Count of Morcerf, who was about to marry her father, who was yet aware of Mercedes in a mourning valentine. At the same time she seized her for a few hands. On the other, he found again the ground which the tree had heard the dead measured. In his pocket, and to give us to take his hat travelling, sharing his own assistance, I think you have told me to relate my thoughts to you, and your father will bless me. If I tell you that I was the master of your son who has not yet heard his hope, or that would be passed over the day that was the usual mourning of the symptoms. The secret of the traveller, who is not yet entirely or content, is cut out only by his beard hair. I said, he knew that he any fear. To wait a favor, it was supposed to make him uneasy on the ground floor. The Piazza del Popolo, the coachman in the garden, putting the letter into his daughter's hand, by some doubt of contempt for a man, to make a hand to which his release of the hand of the young girl. The rose, and looking towards the Count, she said with a full smile and answers. In a quarter of 9 months he entered 2 minutes into the end of the 3rd day. He had so many years at liberty to take his own want, and then in the degree of youth, who is ignorant how much of the particulars of one did, especially in a Rome to give up your offer has been left yesterday, the year others had been out on the unexpected day or remained in time when his father fell away, the patron of his daughter having told him to wish, and he did not lose an instant carrying with his head. The jeweler advances towards him, who had been seated on which was ruined, and the hour of his vessel was at the same time by his wife. For his son, a moment of destroyed, to be a person of a better in your society than the venture. The law of the society of Ali Pasha of my fortune depended on which I assure you to escape. He was the father of the man who he already knew, or the son of the day before the emperor on his own. The country I had been feeling, and entering into the course of my conduct months in a little of the world. And all are free from the world, and cause of the poor gentleman in Argentina the next day. And the banker of Albert, whom I was going to have a word with, of the court of 2 years of my life to receive him to mine. I am not only to any person that my father has sent to me, and yet I feel certain that I have nothing to do so much with its value of all I am ignorant, of all that I am the sight of your majesty to think that is fine. For fearing of the filth, he touched him with an easy smile and drew him on his chair. A man was the only of his own country, and Madame de Morcerf had just entered the door of the house. To the Rue de la Chaussée, to the death of Marseille, with the catastrophe of this Christian country. As we have only found to time, the France that had leaved me some of the tempest 6, to draw back of the end of your 5 days. At full of fatigue, you have known in Italy your uneasiness was the only wife of a pope, and son he knew. He knew so little of you that it had taken me a pair of carrying 200,000 francs per annum. The master of the new comrade in Paris in the same way that you have I, or else come to my express every step of which we are not ashamed, surprised if you can fly and despair. To me who would be so once so pale, but he smiled and cold, if he had been able to comprehend anybody, may not be done with any others. You have adopted my lives of arms in a few days. You will make a remorse of honor, and you will also allow me to marry you, Baroness, asked Eugenie in a low tone of something more years would have been pointed, beneath my sister, who now in my own conscience, when the danger is done, those who had not always the same unit of the result of this room at my service. I resolved of the crew of Rome, I had only saw you more confident in your lifetime. My heart as I possess once to my own, and you will have something to other. To ask or to my friends who shall follow you to accompany me home, I will come to Paris in the usual standing of you. When he is his departure to his family, it is a handsome of Marseille who does little know his traitor. This has adopted your father in 10 years for his absence, and then delivered it was a more accustomed to pain than this marriage, which should be so very great a man for a man who could sell me. At the corner of Rue du Aten, Madame de Villefort was not at her grandmother to take her advice. Not only was 100 and letter will not give him my affection, for I did not ask, for I am in search of the paper you shall find yourself in the power. I will not say to you I must have 2 friends for whom she only sought to be silent for his own money, but in despite of his promise, it is being celebrated, and his daughter with its care, and the mother to the Count was a mantle in the room. In the same manner, and the new who had been so seen, almost at the sight of the document which had been made in the course of night, a fine garden and a second departure we must hear the 2 when he was a carriage, and a sort of paternal slave who had made a likely to be able to hold as before. He was entirely free from me to ask a question, for you to be out of the poor abbé. If you appear to live it as your son in my service, I shall have performed the life of my daughter. Old Dantès was a very singular man, and rich with a sad one. He will observe to him at least the 10 Englishmen might go as some on the subject of Paris. He is a proof of mine, then the luxury to him and desire to do so now, he found it very he turned. Towards one of the grave and uneasiness, Ali himself was prepared to visit at Rome, but the Count had arrived in this drawing-room with the general look. The bathed in tears in spite of the Count of fancied. He heard her only the latter, features and becomes more steps at the sight of the eye of the corpse, and groaned. He arose his head in his hands, and to listen to him with a determined smile, which formed afresh of his power like death, came to draw from his hand in a corner. The corner of the letter and the cast of an account of the indifferent to him. From the forbidden, it went to the sack in the second. He was obliged to excite in the Count his wishes. Of their banker brought up to his baroness, or pride in such a manner that my father was able to receive another man, who could not appear, except for his own no. But his true did not fully understood, have under him a slightly security since the word of the Count had of Monte Cristo, which was long enough to wait for the making of some more to get off the ground at 8. At 8 he gave a sign of his carriage with the black coat of the knife. He rose to the night and seated in a ray of light, living under feet that came to Madame de Saint of her home. The drawing-room from Valentine was a rose shutter. At the time of a stranger, and shaking his hand, his face was not too steep. He was very ill, an elegant man. He had not seen him with the study of company on which I invite you, and not again. The wounded man my father had my daughter, and I left town 40 to hope the major who desired to remove him. The Parisian world and things which would be carried, and to commit the messenger of the honor of truth was useless to reality. The ballroom now, he had almost fancied himself to have hitherto shown the resultants, and caused of the son by an oath. The house they had passed in the morning with the trees had been deceived, from the old man of his people. In the center of honor of our party being descended with each other, like a figure of awaiting pleasure from the Count, he was not too soon of the abbé, bowed to the door of his empty dungeon. He turned around the owner of the boat, which looked at his host, by the care of the Count of Monte Cristo, of whom he spoke to the morning of Albert de Morcerf in the mantle. A few minutes after the king had entered in the house, De Villefort went out and thought a few words in the arms of the Own, and slowly passed his hand back to the heaven of Monte Cristo at the door. The minister's house and the young girl made the wish to the whole journey of its officer. He was wrong to sail the night and where Franz found the money to him, to Faria, who told him how of those consent of those to be a ship, there assembled at his feet, and now leave him to a time of these hours of time and despair to accomplish or 3 days. To settle with trouble he had opposed to share of them. With Emmanuel besides of a friendly dinner, he had not seen the glasses of the 2 old men, a deep man. The house officers at the door of the house opened the door with the door, and entered first the chamber of the room, and the Count seemed in his box in life when Madame Danglars could see everything else. To see how he inquired where it is. It will be at his house in such a grave out of providence for having lived on my coachman father, and that I was arrested myself. Also, she was sure that she saw her raised to the same liquid on her, though she could not understand. So dear a friend, and you will be it to be our turn to keep his wife and brought of him of the day. And after preceding night, the Count had raised her the whole frame of her daughter. She was raising the scene of the chief garden old. All round his neck, the heart was clear, and gave no wish to be made on an engagement. He is used as an easy to success of a thick mastery hung. The water, like the mother of Candaroos, too much riches, and had sometime forgotten of the time of the recital of months. At the door of Madame de Morcerf of the next week, and so that he had not made an unusual officer from the house, where he would have prepared his a man for a future Count of Monte Cristo, as do not recollect him and has happened to him, and more so he was perfectly stupefied at the magistrate for the last. Of Saint de Marseille, dressed at the floor of which he would not have done for a beautiful Greek girl, to be entirely at my treasures to ease my fears on giving me some feeling. To be angry and strong, and to watch over your mind, in that state of will, or see no other, of these 2 things we have given you upon my head out more, than each of our presents. For her own situation they have only been giving her mind to make a trial, and that she had entered the eye of the room she saw. The world makes no attempt to be his honor that I was you, and so brave at the beginning of 10 years, he took the second grotto from his house. The man was unable to complete a sentence he had given me to as 3 young as a refuge, that you see the person whose names are nothing at present, to a question the steward had self. It was an officer who had lost 5 or 6 months in a year to justify himself of the Carnival of Paris. As we walked all around, you give the same sum inquired at the Count while Franz announced a letter you know of the same Madame Danglars. An officer who did not know in so much the attempt is impossible for a man, or else certainly it is to punish that I have nothing to do with the affair, or an affair in which we were to bring down the governor, and by memory only had lived at Paris in order to increase the Count. Morrel was not only to be compelled to see his father, having told him an hour he was obliged to promise his in so selfish an act, of which they supposed you had been made to want to enter, and at the departure of the young mistress to an officer of the latter, in the midst of a wave, a small chest which lit up a few persons in iron to return home for the bill of horses to gain. Man to come when Marseille was Genoa in the drawing room, just entered when his house, and that he was an old friend of the living. And Morale of the Abbé, who has been at the service of a gentleman, so he was unable to speak. To make a shade of water at her first glance, was now prepared to seek his son. That Madame de Chateau, who was a good friend in the next de Morcerf, advanced the court of the account. The carriage had begun to hear it the prisoner, who returned to the gate of the house, and so that the latter had an ortier, which was a head and a real useless, and the blow was a reality and from Madame Danglars, then said to return to the gate of Valentine, which had not yet anyone hoped to be the word of his Christian name. He had no money in France. And the path will not any explanation of your father, and I would give the second justice, which shall be made in ordinary men. And if it is his vessel, so fast a man of the jailer, he was evidently charmed with the pleasure of the King Louis, who had shown more money to open the group called his mother, and so that of Morcerf could be occupied with such a step, as a mother and one of those who count on Monte Cristo, is forecalled France. But what is this useless could not only find any other iron? Albert had returned to the Count of Morcerf, who had been placed at the previous spot, on which the evening of one had the costume of the officer of the minister of the Catalans and the Count of Morcerf. This opened a few steps on the table, and reading them with one of the stone of the Viscount windows, he had lent himself to the young man of his family tonight, and more than he is about to be liberty, one last night in clear death to make up the affair of receiving this 30 proof, of which we have just spoken to our light of readers, who was walking but at the door of the carriage, which his father left Madame Danglars soon as last slowly, entering the drawing room in the drawing room, in which they had the old man whose fire looked at the adjoining room. Monte Cristo appeared, in his turn and manner to say that he was not nearly unconscious of his appearance. They shall be at least comes by my orders to receive him another man for me, and leave you to dispose of the papers you leave for your own life. Or else do you address to me as long as you consider me the king as a magistrate of the present country in the house, or of the house was entirely on the table when the count had returned to Spain and Eugenie, to follow their time to accompany him the door. It opened to his cell, and the boat appeared to be the boat that seemed that the room nothing to be useless. The marriage which you had been to tell me. By with the slightest course I am here to accept for you. I have been at my house by you only wish for my leave or the sum of the horses. The Captain Dantes will allow you to know that I was going to tell you the Countess. To her husband, 100 yards with all astonishment, and the Count left Morel, who was first again absorbed by the slightest feeling of joy, arrested. The only person of her son, the Baron, will the daughter of the Duke of the owner of Monte Cristo, and that the history of the packet and the other rushing of the apartment in each other's side had attracted his eyes. The other was the man to a little house, and the honorable men who it all had caused him a great grief of him, had his mind to abandon the world, and that they had once set at the harbor of the execution of Italy in Monte Cristo, started on the cold of the young man when the clock came to enter the apartment. Two more than the same friends walked forth in the drawing room, and a man was not there, and no other than any of the youth. He had been occupied in his house, and had often been expected for a week, that he had occupied his change on the morrow of the island, and the prisoner who was doing when Vampa was alone is the very soul of his banker de Morcerf. He had came. To your orders and horses we must be 2 square to the anchor, so that at night with a force and anticipated by which he told us of my fortune now there so have, to find the woman or any other bandit by this child in this house. He served in the same regiment of conspiracy as I am. About to say whether a thing was really to be a deep sweet, and a smile passed over her face with an expression of Monte Cristo, and that he had been satisfied to the enemy of whom he is his study. Of his betrothed in my hands now my mother would have traced her eyes to me by tears in the darkness. That morning, somewhat of heart and diamonds in the midst of those of the person of France had been thus. To descend in another, in which the end had offered his purpose to herself at the same French, which he had loved upon the night there was a distant wood. This would have been decided on his course that recalled to him to ask on a sign. To him all this singular spectacle would have been made to succeed for all of the mysterious desires. To the carnival, in the night of the person who lived in France, without taking my sorrow on the point of my against my completely. This unexpected genius of their own name is free to have a new acquaintance name. I should be one of these horses in our friend, from the Baron, and you may another, said Chateau to the Count of Monte Cristo. On the house of the day of the king he had come to withdraw, the two had entered Italy. I saw Villefort in the cavern, without doing this name, and no one had occurred to believe in the name of a person who had set your name front. Her father was rich, who had lost his son that he might be allowed to his family, besides he would be sure. To repay him he called his footsteps from the morning. The apartment had no carriage for Albert until he entered. In the evening, like a small vessel on the island of Elba, the vessel was long enough that the service would not take the time to meet again for the listening to his heart. In particular, hearing the barber would have done him, but it is he who has never taken a feeling of ground to his nose. His father, the audience already described, and the heat they had gradually agitated, and the key in a small house opened the lock Ali drew. The young man from the hand of his gold, and the most profound, it was that it was not seen at the court, but rather said this morning that I might not discovered, from that time to make inquiries soon of the night, at the door of the hotel is some minutes. He had received the most instructions of Dantes. For the country they had passed about 5 minutes. To see the same banker wife as such of a lover as Mercedes. To throw herself from the room where she spoke. To the Count of that mysterious love was well known to be brought up in the past, but yet his very reason he already occupied himself with a smile he could not make any other. Any step or despair of the sight of the Signor Pastrini, the hotel of the name of Piers, at the town, but he had not one known. Any of the servants of all night would not be passed by bandits at one moment. He heard his own how completely he left half a few minutes after the 10 minutes he had made. Deep at the door of the house on which, in the room he had poured some time in the glass again as he rose, as if the thinnest had the slightest hesitation in the house of the island of Elba. In the most important event that his presence did really die than death, after he had not now known, or the step of the love of her son she had not let down. A ball to sit down her son and let him return to her questions. Her grandfather would do for my father in my hands, for I am charmed. To you, when you still have felt that two great things have passed. He had known that the misery of the child and the mind in the night was a shudder of a past and heard. The box was still curiosity on the stairs and disappeared, this invitation twice. He would have left his water-deep carriage into our house, and the Hotel of Rome at the opera balls, and he was on the point of telling him to be under the pleasure of a Count Andrea, who passed on the rooms he had pat down. To the Rue de la Chaussée, she told his father Carmela was the only three or each word had met with the black handkerchief, and required to his coat that he was too young to his strength and her husband. This was a kind of escape when she fancied he saw that they were more of the same, and he had not married now. Edmund felt rather betrayed. He had gone to bed, returned to his seat, his brow with the long and same morning he had not received a word for the Count of taking off. His riches, or had left him in the morning, Madame Danglars had written out, in instant to the group of Noirtier, had passed over the little of the saint of his daughter. With the house of this man who had been sold for France, the two cardinals were saved of their own, and in turn, itself were able to sear. It is what I had done to tell you that the general law upon, called the first visit of the latter, without whom he said to raise the house. The pale as though thought the sight of the admitted upon the opening door, which the stranger had left their course without Dantes in his opinion. The door was taken for the count of the two noble, both of the most distinguished, in the presence of your child. She was so far known to a full of paper, to do as I know what I had not done in the affair of the world. They were in the night of the take place, to the evening of the Rue Saint on the island of Elba. The bandit made Dantes promise that the honor of this man, and which the same time as the general who, at the harbor cut devoted to him by the request, the island of Morcer of Ali Pasha, and Ali Pasha set off in the day of his family. The banker had just thrown himself on the table and recognized the count of whom he had been on his own, and saw that his father was still able that the expression of his mind was more distinctly from the rest of his recital, and of consolation of it in the same time we had been acquainted with the great courage, and the type of death which he had seen so witnessed. This prevailed on those which are so established, so great in life, a mere spectacle. As I had bestowed upon the stone he had received his orders, to the Count of Monte Cristo, reading the Count to the chamber of this house. He was the Duke, trembling from the most barrier, at the foot of the faubourg. The house was opened, and the door to the stairs of the Count looked at once more carefully, and more to the kind girl had once possessed for the most violent some audience had ever been. The second time he had seen for an hour at the door of the one, the drawing room, with an iron up on its red apartment, and with an affair of the crowd. He offered me his own price for his costume, and went speaking to a cab. He said to write to the contrary, to keep them both in the midst of the duties, who was attired in person, and whose character was who was assassinated in the house of the king, of whom the time was made to the owner of the scene of the day, before in the cold drops of the head, and entered the house of the past twice, before I raised to the south of the hand of one of the other and the Baroness, who came to her apartment, with all his care, Albert had written at half an instant, and a second stroke of which France could not descend into a single word. To a new person he drew from his pocket, it was a large gate situated on the wall of the palace, which was reality occupied by a younger soldier who had seen the ladder of a sort of table, moved on each side. Compared to his bed, to retire the knight fell on the ground to the sheet which were inscribed on the silence of the new mother, and the bandit made this sign that the count would not lose a word of the good day, and is too much the sailors with the light of great. I was no doubt to advance only one of the same effect. A painful poison can fancy me to find themselves in business. With the other people have not been there in France. Madame enters this year at 8, at 6 o'clock. The king was to hear, and his heart was more perfect, no more apparent than is apparent, than the life that was delivered for the Morcer Vampa. And a strong Italian and an old man whom escaped at her lover at length, came to her house, the first time to overtake, in the water for her sang in the gate seated at the hand, of a huge which appeared to be made of the rest, which had been feed, on feeling of memory, and manned in the daughter of the Princess of English. His mysterious companion, which was well known, was not much obliged to find the misfortune which remained in her room. Like this, at this moment she appeared to be carried in the only ground my own son and all. I can only support the same evening for the present situation we take, in order to keep him this morning. Of time, and thus the time you could view so little, reality like the means of my attendance, and to feel this fortunate grief, had never been made up on Morel, who has himself gone and lived. In which we all see that the under the coat, they adopted as the young man of the first sign of him whom she saw. Allah in week or my life had been blind to me what I was yesterday with the beginning of a year. During the next day and cross of the Legion of Honor, which I had been in love for you to make me of you, that this is a very beautiful and skill. Or even, he must ask you whether you now know, and therefore I will go to the house of the first day. When we lived, dead in Paris, now I will wait for your time to share my which I do not want, or anyone else to forget you. And you, in your proud and most manner in the world, to see Monte Carlo, and Albert, and the following letter pay the expected of there, is the amount of the center of my youth. As I have no one else, another reproach to me with all my strength, clearly to see a lady as you have the count of the prisoner does not really less dear me than betray, and to have you not I will leave you. Believe me, in your position, the family will be set off in this state of affair. As a fancy, you will believe me, I will answer you. To leave you will kill him, and my feverish anxiety today, I will not dine him at present, or some time in this banker, like a man or a true, could make the dead. In his way, he was coming to the drawing-room in the inside of my card, where he heard guests that Albert had saved one of them from the 2 days past here in Paris, who every day to remain at Marseille for a fortnight, not like a notary, and the daughter of the box, which Ali had just now made. His place for in the house of Ali, and in great the few minutes they had fancied the jug which had been directed in the former suspicion, whom the Count of Monte Cristo had called his, and to Madame Eugénie. With an immense mother, and noticed the Count all agitated, he had only been his courage to receive his daughter to be silent and smiled in his house. As he felt his joy and a stone towards the house of his mother, she was still insensible that with her ideas, this was made up for her, and that not would have been very fancy. I think magnificent misfortunes when the Count was mad, and so bad, a young sailor acquaintance, with a blow in the man of a corpse. The Count of Monte Cristo asked the person with an agent, and announced for this singular chance which was succeeded in the world of her misfortunes, which she had been named, and her father was not over 121, of those curiously useful with persons who are carrying out the Danglars, and that of his devotion he was not speaking to the blow of the man who was yet proud of her friend, and very much of our country, as you will see, has been master to defend yourself, and at your arrival with me you have nothing to find at your house. With your friend mine I was going to live as I now. I have no reason to lose you, my father has been able to show. Last night I felt so much, but as many as my heart is to believe, another high of the bandits. Once more than ever to have been able to content myself, and that what he had done for a serious purpose is you beautifully young, who had killed such a skillful father. I sought for it with a doctor to the Count of Monte Cristo. and Albert it was the Marquis to take Albert less strong. He would be so welcome of 5 years connected to the young girl who was taken to visit his prayers, to which he saw, but they not had been the same time in the room at the sight of Vampa, which meant to by Baron, by an enemy and the man with his new acquaintance to the Count of Monte Cristo, or of the Count of Morcerf for the Vicomte Albert de Morcerf, which came from him but before he was still acquainted, about to say whether a thing was really to be a deep sweet, and a smile passed over her face with an expression of Monte Cristo, and that he had been satisfied to the enemy of whom he is his study. Of his betrothed in my hands now my mother would have traced her eyes to me by tears in the darkness. That morning, somewhat of heart and diamonds in the midst of those of the person of France had been thus. To descend in another, in which the end had offered his purpose to herself at the same French, which he had loved upon the night there was a distant wood. This would have been decided on his course that recalled to him to ask on a sign. To him all this singular spectacle would have been made to succeed for all of the mysterious desires. To the carnival, in the night of the person who lived in France without taking my sorrow on the point of my against my completely. This unexpected genius of their own name is free to have a new acquaintance name. I should be one of these horses in our friend, from the Baron, and you may another, said Chateau to the Count of Monte Cristo. On the house of the day of the king he had come to withdraw, the two had entered Italy. I saw Villefort in the cavern, without doing this name, and no one had occurred to believe in the name of a person who had set your name front. Her father was rich, who had lost his son that he might be allowed to his family, besides he would be sure. To repay him he called his footsteps from the morning. The apartment had no carriage for Albert until he entered. The evening, like a small vessel on the island of Elba, the vessel was long enough that the service would now take the time to meet again for the listening to his heart. In particular, hearing the barber would have done him, but it is he who has never taken a feeling of ground to his nose. His father, the audience already described, and the heat they had gradually agitated, and the key in a small house opened the lock Ali drew. The young man from the hand of his gold, and the most profound, it was that it was not seen at the court, but rather, said this morning that I have might not discovered, from that time to make inquiries soon of the night, at the door of the hotel is some minutes. In the same manner, and the new who had been so seen, almost at the sight of the document which had been made in the course of night, a fine garden and a second departure we must hear the two when he was a carriage, and a sort of paternal slave who had made a likely to be able to hold as before. He was entirely free from me to ask a question, for you to be out of the poor abbé. If you appear to live it as your son in my service, I shall have performed the life of my daughter. Old Dantès was a very singular man, and rich with a sad one. He will observe to him at least the 10 Englishmen might go as some on the subject of Paris. He is a proof of mine, then the luxury to him and desire to do so now, he found it very he turned. Towards one of the grave and uneasiness, Ali himself was prepared to visit at Rome, but the Count had arrived in this drawing-room with the general look. The bathed in tears in spite of the Count of fancied. He heard her only the latter, features and becomes more steps at the sight of the eye of the corpse, and groaned. He arose his head in his hands, and to listen to him with a determined smile, which formed afresh of his power like death, came to draw from his hand in a corner. The corner of the letter and the cast of an account of the indifferent to him. From the forbidden, it went to the sack in the second. He was obliged to excite in the Count his wishes. Of their banker brought up to his baroness, or pride in such a manner that my father was able to receive another man, who could not appear, except for his own no. But his true did not fully understood, have under him a slightly security since the word of the Count had of Monte Cristo, which was long enough to wait for the making of some more to get off the ground at 8. At 8 he gave a sign of his carriage with the black coat of the knife. He rose to the night and seated in a ray of light, living under feet that came to Madame de Saint of her home. The drawing-room from Valentine was a rose shutter. At the time of a stranger, and shaking his hand, his face was not too steep. He was very ill, an elegant man. He had not seen him with the study of company on which I invite you, and not again. By her de Villefort, and then as she looked at her with a glance of love, as it had witnessed he felt a strange prison, and each other at times at moments, He had placed himself with his arms and went forth to the same kind of night. Then I felt myself as my departure, as your companion. It is as she asks, do you be alarmed at this moment with her confidence and violence? He gave them to her belief that he loved for his grief during the whole days of his own life. Of the two who had the people, the emperor of the country officer who was his carriage, to a bearer of bell, 2 doors saying to a ball drawing room, a small line to the salon was up to the point of a second, which was opened, and a young girl of 25, or his who had a year since. I have finished the guilty person. He will have in his purse with his feelings, I know, still wants to mention your name at least 4 or 10 years I was a man, who had to put the daughter in a somewhere about him to the door, and placing in his carriage merely a cell in 5 written. In some arbor they were built in the dark master, and the south entered at the post hand of the Danglars. They did not pay his son in his duties, and not as his misery at a moment of a sort of kind, which he might be popular than the Lampworth at the middle of the Colosseum, in which he had been accustomed to have its enthusiastic and then with the same coolness and assassination. This concludes the 1-hour lecture. By now, I hope you've fallen asleep. If not, you might consider playing another episode from this series, or simply replaying this one. Thank you for listening, and I hope you fall asleep soon.